What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? So this is a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche in 1882, where he was sort of calling the alarm in a sense. And we'll come back to this later in the discussion. But I wanted to open this episode with that quote because I feel like it really tees up the discussion of astrology and puts this context around what I feel is the modern predicament, where we have, we've entered the age of reason. You could say that we are living under the tyranny of reason and the tyranny of mind. And we've sort of lost touch with our interconnectedness, our interpenetration with nature and with ourselves too. And so a big theme of this episode is going to be exploring the history of this kind of separation and this disunity, this disintegration, and the ways that it has started to sort of reify and reaffirm and coalesce in the 20th century and especially in the 21st century. And so I want to talk about, look at the history of our separation from nature, but then the process that we've been going through of healing it and how astrology can play a role in that. So in this episode, I'll be making the case for both the validity and the power of astrology in what I'm calling the denouement of the tyranny of reason. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's going to get deep. And so, take a seat, have some tea, and just kick back and have a listen. And I'll do my best to keep it as short as I can. But also, let's have some fun with it, right? It's a big topic. Astrology. Very large, very large. And I want to just add this disclaimer. We're going to talk about the history of reason, the history of science, going back to the Renaissance. And I'm going to be in various places critiquing science. And I just want to make clear that by no means am I anti-science or anti-reason, right? I'm very much a believer in science and scientific progress. And the points I'm going to be making are pretty nuanced, so it's not rejecting science. It's just pointing out that science and pure reason is not the only modality or the only way of understanding our place in the world and of deriving meaning from life. And not only that, but it can, if it is our only modality, then it can be quite harmful actually and quite alienating. So that's all. Just wanted to make that disclaimer about science. I'm pro science, and I just want to make that clear up front. So in terms of our relationship to nature, I think we're starting to move into a place where we're rediscovering that to a large extent, and I'm thinking about this Terence McKenna quote: "Nature is talking to us. This is not a metaphor." Right. And so that's going to be kind of the theme of our discussion around astrology as we go through this episode. Welcome to Spiritual But Not Ridiculous, a podcast that explores the world of spirituality from a grounded and clear-eyed perspective. I'm your host, Jyotish, a yoga teacher, Vedic astrologer, attorney, and technologist. So astrology is, again, it's a big topic. It's definitely a thing that's blowing up in popularity right now. It's been gaining in popularity going back to at least 10 years ago, I would say. And obviously it had a huge resurgence in the 60s and 70s, but we're going through another resurgence right now. And so I think it's an especially relevant moment for us to be talking about it too. It's one of those interesting things that's so popular, but also so maligned by the mainstream and the intellectual elite at the same time, right? And so it's sort of coming in through the back door, and people are talking about it, working with it. Everybody I know is into astrology at this point. And you see these apps, like CoStar and The Pattern are gaining a lot of traction. Celebrities are talking about them. And so despite this astrology being part of the great superstition purge of the modern era, for the longest time, newspapers have been printing horoscopes, and yeah, we see the mainstream media really covering this resurgence as well. You've got The Atlantic talking about how millennials are really into astrology, going back to 2018. You've got The New Yorker writing about millennials in astrology as well in 2019. And this whole the astrology app industry, I think, is worth $40 million at least as of 2020, according to Business Insider. So it's definitely a thing. And with yoga, where we've got the terminology entering the common lexicon with karma and mantra and all that, it's the same thing with astrology. Everyone talks about Mercury in retrograde and their Saturn return, and everyone knows their sun sign, even if they don't really, quote unquote, believe in astrology. So yeah, it's definitely present in our zeitgeist. And I think our relationship to astrology as a culture is really summed up well in this famous quote from Arthur C. Clarke. "I don't believe in astrology. I'm a Sagittarius and we're skeptical." Right? So it's that idea, right? It's that idea that I think we're able to sort of hold these two ideas simultaneously with a little bit of cognitive dissonance, perhaps. So yeah, in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the history of science, going back to the Renaissance, and the history of religion, and to some extent as it's relevant, and then the 20th century developments that have kind of brought us back to astrology, this very ancient practice. And so I'll eventually wind my way around to talking about Vedic astrology and the differences between Eastern and Western astrology, because I personally practice Vedic astrology, or Jyotish. And actually, in terms of the zeitgeist, a few weeks ago, there was an episode of the New York Times Modern Love podcast that featured a story that kind of revolved around Vedic astrology. So I'll put that in the show notes, and I recommend checking that out as well. But yeah, I think astrology, if you look back over the history of Western civilization, it's been popular during periods of heightened intellectual luminosity, really. So you see it, being used widely in the Greek and Roman antiquity, in the Hellenistic era in Alexandria, in the High Middle Ages, and obviously in the Italian Renaissance and the Elizabethan Age. And so it's something that keeps popping up, right? And famous thinkers, famous astrologers include Plato and Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Dante, Kepler himself, Goethe, Yeats, and Carl Jung, who we'll come back to a little bit. So astrology has been with us for a long time, and I think it's time for us to embrace it, really, is what I'm saying. So some of the common misconceptions about astrology that we'll tease out as we go through the episode include that it's about predicting the future, which it's really not, and we'll talk about that. That it means that the universe is deterministic, or that everything is predetermined. That's also not true. There is free will with astrology, and we'll talk about that later. There's this misconception, I think, that the planets are doing something to us. I think that's a lot of times when you hear somebody sort of criticize it or poo-poo it, they're talking like, oh, it sounds so ridiculous. How can the planets be doing something to us? Because I think most people are still trapped in this kind of materialist worldview, which we'll unpack in a little bit as well. And, there's this notion that astrology is not a science, when in fact it is, and we'll talk about that. So for me, astrology is extremely life-affirming. What it's doing is it's a way of capturing the cycles of life using these very deep archetypes. It's a way of giving you a snapshot of your past karma. And it's ultimately a way of helping you to find balance and courage and inner resolve. It's helping you to utilize your incarnation to the highest, most meaningful and fulfilling manner. It's helping to see that all gifts are wrapped in challenge, and how there's ways to approach challenge in a very graceful way. And I think, a big part of what I'm saying in this episode is that astrology is a way for us to pierce through this tyranny of mind and to overcome the resistance that the mind has to non-rational ways of knowing. So astrology is really nothing less than a grand restoration of soul and a mystique and a redefining of our relationship with nature. It's a poetic recognition and integration of the discoveries of modern physics and depth psychology, which we'll explore as well in this episode. So that's just teeing up the discussion there. I wanted to, before we get into it, really, I wanted to just talk about a way to think about astrology as I go into this discussion. And so, one way to approach it is this yogic view of the nature of reality, which is, whether you're a person who believes in Brahma or the goddess of classical Tantra, the yoga view is that the universe is imbued with intelligence at every level. The universe is self-aware to varying degrees. And so it's like an enormous living entity. And so the cosmos or the goddess or whatever you want to call it is continuously creating the world we live in as an act of play and an act of love. And so this worldview is pantheistic and it's ensouled. And so this is also the view of astrology. These two views are in line. And I think that's why Jyotish or Vedic astrology is ultimately considered to be part of the larger yogic tradition. So in this sense, astrologers are yogis, really, and we'll talk more about this too. But this worldview of this sort of self-aware universe flies in the face of this dogmatic, modern, materialist, scientific worldview. And so there's a real tension here, and that's the tension that I want to try to alleviate in this episode. So another way to think about astrology is that, it's like the Earth. The cosmos is like the Earth. The universe is made up of these various cycles and currents and eddies and waves of energy. And we can see this the most immediately and the most apparently in the orbit of the planets and other celestial bodies. But it's also there in these kind of unseen energetic forces. And some of these forces science has already recognized, like gravity and electromagnetism, right? So it's just it's invisible forces that are out there. And astrology is also a way to tap into those and in some sense to measure those things or to understand the cyclical nature of those, right? And so the planets are both reflecting and magnifying these cosmic forces. And this is part of what we'll come to understand in this episode. And it's so important. I think this discussion is so important because the cosmology of a civilization ultimately reflects and influences all human activity and understanding within that civilization. So I think that's that important, And just I'll finish this introduction with a brief history of my own relationship with astrology. So going back to 2013, I was in a Burning Man camp just through happenstance. It wasn't even something I had planned on doing. At the last minute, I joined this Archetypal Astrology Burning Man camp. So it was like 70 people, mostly astrologers, offering astrology to the playa as our gift to the playa. And it was fascinating because it was like a deep immersion into astrology, kind of jumping into the deep end in a sense. And it was beautiful because I was with all these people who were talking about these archetypes that I had never really heard much about before. And I'd always been curious about astrology, but this was my first real deep exposure to it. And, we'll see in a minute that a big part of my thinking around astrology has been influenced by this astrologer and academic, Rick Tarnas. And what's crazy is that he was in our camp, and I knew he was in our camp, but I didn't really know who he was, So looking back now, just amazed that I was in a Burning Man camp with Rick Tarnas. So 2013 was when I really started to get curious about it. And then it wasn't until a few years later that I went to the jungle and did ayahuasca in Peru and in the Amazon. And that experience really opened me up to other kind of ways of thinking and being more deeply than, let's say, yoga had before that. And that's when I hired my first astrologer. I came back from the jungle and immediately hired a Western astrologer and had a reading. And that reading was so profound and so transformative. And I gained such deep respect for the practice of astrology. And then a few months later, I went to India. I found one of my teachers in the Himalayas, who was also a Jyotishi, who practices Vedic Astrology. And I got a reading from him. And that was also very eye-opening and sort of just made me feel understood in a deep way for the first time, and really gave me the courage to start to approach my life in a new and creative way. And then a year after that, I had another Western reading, more of an archetypal reading with Erica Jones, one of the women in my Burning Man camp. And that reading was so profound, so transformational. And just to give one example, towards the end of the reading, she asked me this question: the cosmos wants to know why I'm refusing to wield my power. And it was one of those questions. It was like a Zen koan, my mind went blank. I had no thoughts, and I realized that I didn't have any conception of my relationship to power. And it sent me on this long journey of exploring my relationship to power and, understanding different kinds of power and soft power. And it really changed my whole perspective around power. And that was just one of many, many things in that reading. So I've had this great journey through astrology, and I'm so blessed and fortunate now to be, trained in as an astrologer in Vedic astrology and offering readings. So it's a real passion of mine. It's maybe my favorite thing right now. So I'm so excited to go into this episode and to explore it. Let's go back and explore the history of science and to some extent religion in order to tee up a discussion of the relevance of astrology in the modern world. So in order for us to understand how we've gotten to this place in modernity of skepticism and materialism and a rejection of these deeply powerful ancient ways of understanding nature and the universe and our relationship to it, I think we need to go back to the Renaissance to understand sort of the trajectory of Western thought and how that ultimately led to a rejection of the ensoulment of nature, basically. And so I want to start this section with a quote from Rick Tarnas. "One need not be graced with prophetic insight to recognize that we are living in one of those rare ages, like the end of classical antiquity or the beginning of the modern era, that bring forth, through great stress and struggle, a genuinely fundamental transformation in the underlying assumptions and principles of the cultural worldview. Ours is an age between worldviews, creative yet disoriented, a transitional era when the old cultural vision no longer holds and the new has not yet constellated." So I think that quote tees up nicely our little trip back in time to the Renaissance and to the Copernican revolution, which was in large part this turning point that led to the modern world. Because I think to understand astrology and its significance in our present moment, it's necessary to understand how we got here, this kind of strange inflection point where we are slowly and suddenly finding our way out from under the tyranny of mind and the tyranny of reason. So let's explore the history of Western thinking. And I just want to say that my thinking around this subject has been primarily influenced by Rick Tarnas, but also Fritjof Capra, Amit Goswami, and my teacher Anand Mehrotra. So much gratitude to all of them for shining the light or helping me to find the light of the darkest night. So the Copernican revolution, if you go back about 600 years, at that point, everyone thought that the sun revolved around the earth and the earth was flat. And so there was a real significance to Copernicus helping people to understand or start to understand that the sun was actually at the center of the solar system. He showed that if you changed that perspective, that all the math of around astronomy would actually become quite simple and much simpler. And what's fascinating about this too, as somebody who studied the history of the East and India especially, is that this is a sharp contrast to what yogis and Jyotishis and other people in India at that time understood. I mean, at that point, people in India had understood for thousands of years, if not longer, that the Earth rotated around the sun. And so it's like Europe is coming quite late to this party. But yeah, so Copernicus and then those who followed sort of shifted quite substantially the way that people thought about our place in the universe because of this heliocentric revolution. It's a fundamental turning point in Western civilization. So up to that point, there was, everyone believed in this sort of grand cosmic order and in sort of this interconnected relationship with nature. And I want to emphasize too that Copernicus and Kepler and Newton, all these guys, all these early pioneers, they still saw their scientific breakthroughs and realizations as divine illuminations, as like spiritual awakenings to this grand cosmic order. So they weren't. It's not like we went straight from superstitious beliefs and religious dogma straight to pure reason and science, right? It was a gradual process of still living in that sort of cosmic order universe, so to speak. So they believed that there was this cosmic order that was created by some creator to be known and admired by human intelligence. And I think it's important for us to understand that was still the kind of in the milieu at the time. So for these early pioneers in modern science, the primal world was still ensouled and alive and living, a conscious thing that was communicating with us, right? Again, Terence McKenna, nature is talking to us, right? So as science and Western philosophy evolved over the centuries, it did increasingly reject the old ensouled primal world in favor of reason and understanding everything through the mind. But it was a gradual process. And I think this movement away from superstition and religion towards reason and science was happening for good reason, obviously, right? We needed to sort of do away with the abuses of religious dogma and to increase personal freedom, I think, through this revolution. We needed this course correction. But part of what I'm going to be outlining in this episode is that in that process, we lost something along the way. We overcorrected and we lost touch with the intelligence of nature, I think. Because reason and this modern worldview that we still exist in today is a worldview of separation and mechanization, right? This view that the modern world is a mindless machine filled with atoms that are set in motion by an intentionless Big Bang with no inherent order or purpose in a cold and empty universe. It's a deeply alienating worldview. And so what I think is fascinating is that this sort of a priori assumption about the nature of reality that it's separate and that it's mechanistic and materialistic and all that, it was really an assumption that all of scientific discovery was founded upon, but it wasn't the result of a scientific hypothesis that was then proven out, right? So it's still to this day our sort of cosmological understanding of the nature of the cosmos is still based on an assumption, which I think is fascinating because, scientists today are so arrogant and dogmatic about this assumption, despite the fact that it's just an assumption. So anyways, we'll come back to that. But it was Francis Bacon really and Rene Descartes who made this assumption into kind of an accepted fact, right? They thought that objects out there cannot contain any human qualities or projections, right? It seemed like it was inconsistent with this new scientific worldview that they were developing. And so we live in the shadow of this assumption today. And this assumption, it did seem to pay dividends, right? It seemed to support the advance of progress, especially technological progress. And the more that we saw the world and nature as something to be manipulated and dominated, and the more we saw it as separate, the more we seemed to achieve a sort of progress with that. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about the arrogant superiority of those who are still enthralled by the cult of mind that came out of this, and the fact that it's entirely based on a set of assumptions that have actually failed to keep up with the two biggest developments of the 20th century, which we'll talk about in a minute, is an important point that I don't want to get lost. So with this split, that is being driven between us and the cosmos, we begin to see nature as a mere resource to be exploited for human benefit. Before the 17th century, the goals of science were wisdom, understanding the natural order, and living in harmony with it. In the 17th century, this attitude, which we could call an ecological attitude, changed into its opposite. Ever since Bacon, the goal of science has been knowledge that can be used to dominate and control nature. And so today, both science and technology are used predominantly for these purposes, which we can see is a dangerous and harmful and anti-ecological endpoint. And so, again, we see nature as mechanistic, impersonal, unconscious, and simply there to do our bidding. And it's just because we say so. And so nature seems to comply, at least it did until the 19th century. But I think that the nature of the cosmos, too, is that it just reflects back to us whatever we project onto it. And so if we think that nature is mechanistic and impersonal and unconscious, then I think the cosmos will happily reflect back to us this reality. And so in that sense, I think the cosmos has infinite patience. So I think the sad part of this story is that, the price we pay for this kind of arrogant, alienating worldview is living in a state of alienation. We've achieved autonomy over nature in exchange for alienation, which I think is too big of a price to pay. And so with this evolution up through Francis Bacon and René Descartes and all these Western European scientists and philosophers, what develops is a absolute superiority of the Western mind over all others. Other worldviews, other eras, other time periods, other cultures especially, and other modes of cognition. And again, it's not like there was a scientific proof that this worldview was superior. It was just all an assumption, everyone just adopted it and then just kind of lorded that superiority over others. And I think this alienation and this separate worldview is uniquely a product of the mind and the ego, which by its very nature sees everything as separate. You could even say that this alienation and this sort of separation is one of the primary European exports, this tyranny of mind. So I'm happy to say that I think we are finally truly reckoning with it in this current era. And of course, it's no accident that the Renaissance and the Age of Reason that we're talking about coincided with the birth of modern colonialism, because this arrogant supremacy of a certain kind of European way of life was then thrust upon the rest of the world, in violent ways. And so I think, we can say that the tyranny of mind, this European worldview, is itself a form of colonialism. And this is why I think it's largely the spiritual traditions of non-European cultures or pre-Renaissance traditions that are increasingly becoming the antidote to our modern crisis of meaning. And again, like I said at the beginning, I'm not anti-reason or anti-science. I support a holistic approach to life that includes the mind, but not at the expense of the heart and the soul, or the environment for that matter. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the history of the development of science going back to the Renaissance and then coming up through the Enlightenment. And I wanted to go into a little sidebar about monotheism and then the death of God, right? So another big influence here is the trajectory that we take once we start moving into the Age of Reason, where religion plays less and less of a role, but it also has a heavy influence on what I think is the scientific worldview without maybe scientists acknowledging this, right? So if you look at monotheism in Europe, they believe that man was made in the image of God. And so God in that conceptualization is the supreme subject who created the world as a separate object. And so as a result, because we're made in the image of God, we're separate. God is separate up there somewhere in some other reality. Heaven is separate. So I think there's this approach to the world that comes from monotheism and from European religion. Christianity heavily influences this scientific worldview that comes out of Europe as well. And so then as reason started to rise and religion began to wane slowly, then, Europeans had to take on that role of supreme intelligence presiding over this alien world, this mindless, soulless vacuum with no inherent purpose beyond serving our material needs. And so we can trace this process of increasing alienation through Descartes, Locke, and Hume, and Kant, and all these Western philosophers, Schopenhauer, Darwin even, and Marx. And then Nietzsche, who had the wherewithal to see what was happening. And he really kind of raised the alarm, I think. In 1882, Nietzsche declared that God is dead. And actually, I think I wanted to share the full quote from that, actually. So here's Nietzsche. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? And so, I think this is Nietzsche being very insightful here and, calling attention to the sort of trouble that we've gotten ourselves into by the late 19th century. And so then you can see the trajectory of modern philosophy after that seems deeply troubled. If you look at the existentialists from Kierkegaard to Heidegger and Sartre and Camus, if you read their works, which I did in law school because I think I was feeling very existential back then, you see that, they're deeply disturbed, I think, by this alienation, right? That's kind of the overarching theme of existentialism. So by the end of the 19th century, we've ended up in this situation where, just like the antiquated view that the Earth was at the center of the universe, we are now suffering from this flawed perspective, placing the human perspective at the center of knowing. And so we're in this deep state of alienation. We feel that man is just this kind of curious accident resulting from random and meaningless collision of atoms and Darwinian evolution. And so it's not a very comforting place to be, right? But fortunately, we then have 2 or 3, depending how you want to count it, these developments that come in the 20th century that begin to offer a different way. And that's what I want to explore in the next section. So in the 20th century, we see these 2 developments that both arise out of the scientific endeavor. There's depth psychology and there's quantum physics. And so these 2, I think, are the key to saving us from ourselves, so to speak, or for undoing the tyranny of reason in the 20th century. So let's look at depth psychology first. So starting in the late 19th century and going into the early 20th century, we see the influence of Nietzsche actually on psychology. And so this relatively new field of psychology develops with William James in America and Freud and Jung in Europe. And as we start to see the recognition of the existence of an unconscious, the mind starts to lose its position of power. You've got Sigmund Freud coming in first and developing his theory of the unconscious and the influence of the unconscious. And so it's like if all of a sudden we're at the mercy of all these unconscious influences, what does that mean for the supremacy of mind, right? For the supremacy of reason? It means there's trouble afoot. So it's like, what is going on here? What does it mean that there's an unconscious, right? And so Freud really set the stage here. And then, William James talked a lot about the importance of acknowledging the existence of all kinds of other ways of being and different types of conscious states, and Carl Jung, though, came in and really ran with it. And he's the one who started to introduce these modalities from antiquity and to have truly an open mind when it comes to how to understand ourselves and our place in the world. And so he brings in this depth psychology that is then located at the intersection of the Enlightenment. It's still science, but then also Romanticism. So it brings in the humanities and mysticism. It's mythic, it's symbolic, it's numinous, and it's a real challenge to pure rationality in a beautiful and important way. And in Jung, I think these two developments that I'm talking about, depth psychology and quantum physics, they go hand in hand because Jung was friends with Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli and all these guys, and so he was heavily influenced by their work in quantum physics. And so Jung here starts to, in his practice with patients, he starts to encounter profound synchronicities. There are some great ones documented in some of his books and some of the papers that come out of that time. But I just wanted to highlight one to give an illustration. So he had this, in the early days, I think around the turn of the century, Jung had this young female patient, and she was a real tough nut to crack. Like, they weren't making any progress in her therapy. And part of that was because she always knew better about everything, and she had a very good education. So this gave her this kind of ideally suited kind of armor for breaking through any kind of mental barriers, and kind of a highly polished, like, Cartesian rationalism and a very linear idea of reality. And so Jung was having a very hard time getting through to her. And so after many fruitless attempts to soften her rationalism with compassion and these other techniques, Jung began to just hope for some kind of unexpected and irrational breakthrough, that something would happen that would burst her intellectual bubble. And so they were in a therapy session one time, and he was sitting opposite her with his back to the window, listening. And she was talking about this impressive dream that she had had the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, this costly piece of jewelry. And while she was telling him this dream, he heard something behind him gently tapping on the window. And so he turned around and he saw that there was this very large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in an attempt to get into the room. And this seemed very strange to him. So he immediately opened the window and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. And it was a scarabid beetle, a kind of gold-green beetle that was actually not really known in those parts of Switzerland at that time. And so it looked like a golden scarab. And so he then handed the beetle to his patient, saying, "Here's your scarab." And this experience punctured the hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. And then they could continue with their course of treatment, which became quite successful. And so it was experiences like this that really influenced Jung heavily and caused him to research and to think deeply about synchronicities. And so Jung started to understand that synchronicity can be very healing because it's uniting the inner and outer world and imbuing your experience with that of deeper meaning and order. And he saw it as the intervention of grace. Grace is, in most traditions, the way that the cosmos or nature sort of steps in and sends you these little signals, or gives you these little nudges towards evolution or towards surrender or towards trust, And so Jung saw synchronicity as this intervention of grace and a way to kind of nudge patients to move towards greater wholeness and individuation. Because with these synchronistic events, you are forced to surrender your attitude of like a knowing superiority into a state of unity, and to acknowledge the intelligence of nature, and to then unify the conscious and the unconscious. And then as a result, you start to open up more to the world. And so it's a means for greater personal expansion and for integration. And I think you can say the same things about astrology, as we'll see. And of course, practicing using synchronicity in this way, it requires a pretty evolved therapist, and you have to make sure that you're avoiding any projection or narcissism when looking for synchronistic events in the world. But astrology is similar in that way, where it does require an astrologer who's kind of wise and developed enough to recognize patterns within things without projecting their own unresolved issues onto that. But anyways, Jung saw nature and a person's surrounding environment as this living matrix of potential synchronistic meaning that could illuminate the human sphere, right? As Rick Tarnas put it. So Jung started to see these synchronistic phenomena as fundamentally archetypal in nature. And he saw that archetypes are the fundamental governing principles of the human psyche. For Jung, archetypes are these autonomous patterns of meaning that inform the soul and matter. They bridge mind and matter. They bridge the inner and outer. These archetypes are very powerful in that way. And so Jung saw both psychological and spiritual aspects to this process of working with the archetypes and the archetypal unconscious. So here we see kind of a tentative first step towards bridging both science and religion with this archetypal worldview, kind of creating a new spirituality. I mean, Jung was doing a lot for humanity in the 20th century. And so as a result of this process with synchronicity and archetypal synchronicity, Jung pretty quickly becomes drawn towards astrology. As early as 1911, we see evidence of him using astrological charts in his work with his patients. And so Jung has been quoted as saying that for him, astrology represents the sum of all psychological knowledge of antiquity. And so, yeah, he's using astrology readings in his work with patients, and in this process, and as he's starting to talk publicly about this, he's really taking on this enormous task of combating this Enlightenment tendency to uphold rational autonomy and to deprecate, antiquity and earlier worldviews. And he becomes quite successful at it, especially in his later years. So if you're not as familiar with archetypes, they're basically a recurring symbol or motif in literature or art or mythology, and represent, especially from the standpoint of psychoanalysis, they represent a primitive mental image that's inherited somehow from our earliest human ancestors and present in the collective unconscious. So examples include the great gods and goddesses of ancient mythic traditions, including yoga. You've got, Homeric and Greek and Roman and Hindu archetypes, these deep, powerful archetypes. And so Jung pretty quickly came to regard archetypes as expressions not only of a collective unconscious that's shared by all human beings, but also part of a larger matrix of being and meaning that informs and encompasses the physical world and the human psyche. That's where he ended up. And this reminds me, Joseph Campbell, as I'm sure you know, was heavily influenced by Carl Jung and this archetypal research that he was doing. And so this reminds me of a Joseph Campbell quote. "It would not be too much to say that myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into human cultural manifestation." So that's Joseph Campbell talking about the power of archetypes, really. Myth is basically a system of conveying archetypes through story. So we'll see in a moment what's nice about archetypal astrology and the fact that astrology works with archetypes. The planets have archetypes, and the signs, Aries, Sagittarius, Capricorn, they all have archetypes, and even the houses have archetypes. The advantage of working with these archetypes in astrology is that these archetypes are multifaceted, they're multivalent, and they allow us to sort of work with and communicate with the energies that are present in the cosmos in a way that's collaborative and that makes room for the human will. And this is what creates the dynamic interplay between the human will and the cosmos, these archetypes. So that's the rise of depth psychology in the 20th century, and the ways that, especially coming through Carl Jung, it starts to undermine and sort of unravel and soften the tyranny of mind and the tyranny of reason in such a powerful way. And we're still living in the shadow of those developments. I mean, we're still reaping the benefits of depth psychology. And I think Carl Jung should be given a lot of credit for bringing a lot of this into the common zeitgeist. And so then that brings us to quantum physics, the other major development of the 20th century that really starts to show the cracks that exist in the age of pure reason, right? And quantum physics is, like depth psychology, ultimately coming out of the scientific tradition, right? So it's pure reason sort of like running up against its own limitations again. So I think you could say with quantum physics, the centuries-long project of the mind has kind of reached its limit, and it was being forced to recognize its limitations. In modern physics, the image of the universe as a machine is now starting to be replaced in quantum physics with that of an interconnected dynamic whole whose parts are essentially interdependent and have to be understood as patterns of a cosmic process. But what's crazy about this to me is that I feel like we still live today in terms of our shared cosmology as if this never happened. You know, we don't really live as if the universe is an interconnected dynamic whole whose parts are interdependent, right? We still live, I think, in large part in a Newtonian sort of understanding of the nature of the cosmos. But this is despite the fact that 100 years ago, quantum physics abandoned the mechanical universe model in favor of this network of interconnected fields. So I think it's almost like we've failed to catch up. You know, we're still operating in this Newtonian mindset. And what a crazy lag that is of 100 years, right? And I'm curious, I don't know, I'd be curious to see, do they teach quantum physics in schools today? And what do they say about it? I'm really curious about that. So I wanted to talk about the work in particular of Geoffrey Chew and David Bohm. These are the two, I think, biggest thinkers around quantum physics in terms of its impact on cosmology and the parallels that it draws from Eastern mysticism. And so here I want to quote from Fritjof Capra's amazing book, The Tao of Physics, where he talks about the work of Geoffrey Chew. As we penetrate into matter, nature does not show us any isolated basic building blocks, but rather appears as a complicated web of relations between the various parts of the whole. These relations always include the observer in an essential way. The human observer constitutes the final link in the chain of observational processes, and the properties of any atomic object can only be understood in terms of the object's interaction with the observer. This means that the classical idea of an objective description of nature is no longer valid. The Cartesian partition between the I and the world, between the observer and the observed, cannot be made when dealing with atomic matter. In atomic physics, we can never speak about nature without, at the same time, speaking about ourselves. So this, I think, sums up nicely where we've arrived with quantum physics and the ways that perfectly reflects the Eastern mysticism and the yogic worldview and how these two traditions are coming together so beautifully. So, you know, in this new worldview that's posited by physicists like Geoffrey Chew and Amit Goswami, the universe is seen as a dynamic web of interrelated events, not particles or atoms or objects, right? And it's the same thing that ancient yogis had realized thousands of years ago through their own access to the inner world and the inner sort of shruti and smriti, these realizations and these rememberings they were going through in their deep meditative processes. And so what's interesting about the work of Geoffrey Chew especially is, and other physicists too, is they start to have to grapple with the existence of consciousness and the way that human consciousness is impacting their experiments, basically. So it's like in modern physics, physicists are left staring consciousness in the face. And quantum theory has made it clear that all of this can only be understood as links in a chain of processes that terminate in the human consciousness. So everything in the universe is connected to everything else, and no part of it is fundamental. It's all just a web of relationships. And this is part of what we're acknowledging in astrology. And this is part of how astrology is able to help us to see these interconnected relationships and this web of energy that's where everything is affecting everything else at all times. In a sense, this is what we're talking about when we talk about the archetypal dynamics of astrology, is this deep interpenetration of reality and of the cosmos. So I wanted to talk for a minute about my own personal journey with science as an explanatory ethos. For me, growing up in the 70s and 80s in America, I feel like I grew up in this kind of golden age of science. We had Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking and these luminary figures who were out there earnestly trying to answer the big questions through the scientific method and through physics and through metaphysics. And we really felt like science had the answers to all of our questions if we just applied the scientific method and kept an open mind. And I feel like what's happened in the past 40 plus years is that scientists and science has become corrupted by human fallibility, and it's become very dogmatic, And of course, I'm not talking about medical science or biology. I feel like those fields are continuing to advance and to a large extent still making a lot of important advances in terms of extending human life and improving human life and all that. But what I'm talking about is really more the metaphysics and the physics side of science, which I feel has become very dogmatic and still behaves to a large extent as if we live in this Copernican world of materialism. And there's this kind of like a dogma around it. If you question the Newtonian Cartesian worldview, this is tantamount to blasphemy in certain scientific circles, right? Even though we've seen all these developments of psychology and all the quantum physics, it's like our society as a whole has not fully integrated those discoveries, is how I feel, and how it feels to live in this modern world. And I think that's where a lot of the skepticism and arrogance around a practice like astrology comes from, is this lag that we seem to be living in between the discoveries of quantum physics, especially, and the antiquated worldview of, the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So we see how the history of Western progress since Copernicus and the Enlightenment is one of increasing obeisance to the mind over all other ways of knowing and being, over the heart, the gut, the soul, intuition, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm not anti-reason. I think reason is essential. Critical thinking is essential. But as with the ego in yoga, we seek to refine the mind and put it in its proper place alongside the heart and pure consciousness. In yoga, the word for mind is manas, which literally translates to heart-mind. And so there's a significance there, because I feel like the ancient yogis were recognizing this reality that the entirety of our being and the way that we understand the world and interact with the world should come from a unification of the heart and the mind. So that's my personal journey with science as this kind of grand explainer. And I want to end this section with a quote from Amit Goswami. If more people knew that consciousness and not matter is the link that connects us with each other and the world, then their views about war and peace, environmental pollution, social justice, religious values, and all other human endeavors would change radically. So it's really a question of education, I think. Okay, so that's quantum physics. And I wanted to the third development that some of you may be thinking about, wait, why haven't you talked about psychedelics, right? I think psychedelics are part of this picture too. And I do just want to briefly touch on that because it is relevant. So first of all, in terms of Eastern mysticism and the influence of that on the West and on America in particular, there's obviously a long tradition going back to the Transcendentalists in the early 19th century with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. they were, Henry David Thoreau was reading the Bhagavad Gita back then. So there was this long history of the influence of the East on the West. You had yogis like Vivekananda and Yogananda coming to America in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so that was definitely happening. And then especially once psychedelics started to enter the picture, with Albert Hofmann discovering LSD in 1943, which was the same year that they were beginning to enrich plutonium for the first atomic bomb. So I think there's an interesting parallel there, or symmetry. You had that development. You had Robert Gordon Wasson going into Mexico and doing magic mushrooms, and then being documented by Life magazine, which heavily influenced Tim Leary and Ram Dass. And this then opened up, the West and the Western mind to these other traditions, because you have, of course, Ram Dass, who was originally Richard Albert, going off to India and studying with Neem Karoli Baba, and coming back and bringing all this yoga back, right? And then yoga kind of started to explode in the West. So obviously there is this other development happening in addition to depth psychology and quantum physics. But I think those two especially are interesting because they come out of the scientific tradition. Okay, so that's kind of how we got here. And so coming back to astrology. Astrology is a revival and a recognition of what you could call the participation mystique. With astrology, we are ensouling the world once again, and we are giving humans this participatory role in a dance with the cosmos. Because as we've now seen, there's this embedded intelligence in the cosmos. It's a living matrix of synchronistic meaning, right? As Carl Jung showed us. It's intervening in our lives through grace. And so astrology, I think, because of this, is offering a new kind of spirituality. It's ecological, it's earth-oriented, it's post-patriarchal. It's so powerful in that way. Going back to the early 19th century, there was a reaction to the Enlightenment, of course, which was called Romanticism. And here we had thinkers like Rousseau and Goethe and Emerson, and those guys were starting to react to the alienation that comes from the age of pure reason. And this came back to us once again, I think, in the 60s counterculture. And so there has been this recurring rise of Romanticism, and I think you could see astrology as the new Romanticism in a sense. We've seen the outcome of the cosmic hubris of presuming that we alone can infuse the world with meaning and decide what's real and what's not. Maybe the universe is not cold and empty and random just because we say it is. I mean, that's how much power we think we have, right? So I think healing this divide and finding a new worldview that ensouls the world once again is the key to healing ourselves as a humanity. Astrology can be a means for unifying the mind, the heart, and the soul. Because without a life of meaning to aspire to, people can fill this void with all sorts of empty pursuits, like increasing profits or gaining more political power or creating ever more engaging and enticing technology that distracts us from the void, right? This kind of manic techno-consumerism that we've been encountering in the past 10, 20 years. Of course, advertisers have taken great advantage of this void, offering products and services that temporarily distract us from the void, right? And this dearth of meaning is also what often drives people back to religious fundamentalism or into conspiracy theories. So, healing this divide through a practice like astrology or yoga or any other spiritual practice seems especially crucial in this time. So now I want to spend a few minutes talking about this question of free will versus determinism, because I think, again, a lot of people, they hear about astrology and they think that it's this predictive practice that means we have no free will, right? And it's not as black and white as that. Of course, material realists would see astrology as deterministic and superstitious. That's how holistic practices and how holistic ways of being appear to the narrow materialist mind. So I wanted to start this discussion of free will versus determinism by talking about the concept of karma. In the Yoga Vedantic tradition, the cosmos is basically a series of layers or nested self-organizing systems. And so at every level of reality, you have this self-organizing system. And the way the whole system operates is through this cascading cause and effect of karma, right? But within that, because everything is consciousness and everything is connected, nothing is predetermined. It's just that there are these past influences operating in every moment, but in every moment, there can be a truly free choice between expansion and contraction. And so that's the way karma works. Karma is basically this self-organizing system. And so it's true that everyone is living inside of a world that is to some extent influenced by past karma. But what astrology is doing is it's giving us a picture of or a snapshot into this karma. And when you are more aware of your karma, then you can more intentionally work with it and transcend it or burn through it. And there, in the yoga tradition, there are practices that specifically do that. But astrology too can help you to do that. And so that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about free will and determinism. It's what I was saying earlier too about how these archetypal dynamics are at play, these energy fields are at play. But within all of that, it's like you're on a landscape, you're on a terrain, and within that terrain there are certain constraints. You can't sort of go in one direction or another because there's a rock wall or whatever, but you can go around it. You can choose your path through that terrain. And that's kind of what we're talking about here with astrology and how it's both free will and not free will, right? How there's both the reality of your environment, both physical and energetic, but also within that, your own personal choice to rise above it or transcend it or to overcome challenges. And so that's one way of answering the free will question. And then I just wanted to say too, how free is the average person, right? And so I think the first step is to move into a state of increasing freedom by using astrology or some other mechanism for sort of identifying these challenges you may have in life and then helping you to become more conscious of it, because I think today most people are simply operating on autopilot, on past conditioning, on fear, on ignorance. And so it's in this state that people are so easily manipulated, right? And they're just reacting. They're just reacting to stimuli. There's not really any free choice happening there. And so I think it's so important to help to expand consciousness and increase awareness and to release and let go of past conditioning, whether that's conditioning from family or society or culture, and to start to move into a place of greater free will. And so I think it's important to guide the discussion in that direction. And I think astrology can really help with that. Help to move us into a state of greater awareness, awareness of our conditioning and also awareness of our past karma. And so that's an important thing to remember as well. And so as we move into alignment through yoga practice or just through awareness, through astrology, we start to experience life as flowing through us without restriction. And so the greater the awareness in your life, the greater chance of true freedom. And so astrology is offering a chance at true freedom, really. And so another way of saying this is that the natal chart, your chart in astrology, shows the pure potential of the individual. It's the ultimate kind of gateway into free will, so to speak. So astrology is not prediction, but it's the interplay of archetypal dynamics in this field, right? It's a participatory human role. We're shaped by circumstantial factors, and this is co-created through human will and intelligence. There's a human will component operating here. There's the terrain and your response to the terrain. It can be conscious or unconscious, and it's really up to you. And so astrology, you could say it's the process of making conscious what is unconscious, or freeing the conscious self from being a puppet of unconscious forces. And in terms of the role of the planets and why we look at the planets and the stars and the constellations, it's not that the planets and stars are causing events in your life to happen or in the world to happen, but it's that they're part of a larger pattern or like a system of energetic eddies that we are all a part of. So of course, the planets themselves, because of these unseen forces like gravitational and electromagnetic and morphic fields and all that, may be to some extent exerting direct influence on us. But for the most part, a better way to think about it is that there are these energetic cycles and patterns in the cosmos, and the planets can be used and the stars can be used as almost like a measurement device, like a clock, right, that shows the recurrence of these patterns. And so we're looking to these celestial objects as a means to see these larger patterns in the cosmos. And of course, this brings us back to the discussion of quantum physics as well. Because everything is this interconnected web, we are in this kind of participatory dance with all the matter around us. And so because the planets are closer in proximity to us, and then some of these constellations, out into the galaxy, there is this interplay, this interpenetration that's happening. And so there is an influence happening, and we can highlight that influence through astrology. And so I think we need to break this free will determinism binary. There's free will and there is a recognition of the reality of the world. I think it's delusional to think that you have absolute control over your life. And I think this is part of the hangover we have of this tyranny of mind, is that it gives us this illusion that we do have absolute control over nature, when we actually don't. We have some level of control over our lives. And I think astrology is helping us to come back into a more calibrated and reasonable way of approaching that. But again, ultimately, we are always free at any moment to choose between contraction and expansion in our lives. So that's free will versus determinism. I wanted to say a little bit about Jyotish, or Vedic astrology, and how that compares with Western astrology, and then talk about what you can expect from a reading if you ever do a reading with an astrologer, a Vedic astrologer in particular. The astrology that I practice is from the Indian tradition. It goes back thousands of years. In fact, it's mentioned in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest written text known to man, and that's been dated as recent as, I think, 1500 BC, but actually it was part of an oral tradition, and it's really hard to date these books because they were hand copied using palm fronds over the course of millennia. So it's possible, some Indian scholars think it's possible that the Rig Veda was 5, 6, 7,000 years old. So that's, what is that? That's 3, 4, 5,000 BC. So anyways, point being, Vedic astrology, or Jyotish, was mentioned in the Rig Veda. So it's quite an old tradition going back in the Indian subcontinent. And the word Jyotish simply means the illumination of the divine, or the science of light. And so this encapsulates what we've been talking about in this episode. It's the light that helps us to understand ourselves. And in Jyotish, or in Vedic astrology, we see the celestial bodies as the keepers of karma, right? Or the reflection of karma onto ourselves. And it's this recognition, again, that the manifest reality we're all a part of is made up of cycles that repeat. So in the Western system, they use what's called the tropical system, which just means that it's oriented around the sun. And to some extent, the Western system is sort of an abstraction on top of the reality of astronomy. Whereas in Vedic, we use the sidereal system, which is a more literal system, where when we say that a certain planet or a certain star is on the horizon, for example, then it actually is. Whereas in Western, it's shifted by a little bit. And this difference results from the wobble of the Earth. So as you may know, the Earth is rotating around the sun and spinning on its own axis, but it's also slightly wobbling, or the axis of the Earth is slightly wobbling. And that creates this difference between Eastern and Western. And what's fascinating is, of course, that the ancient yogis somehow knew about this wobble, whereas it took us in the West a long time to come to this realization and to measure it. But basically, all that means in practical terms is that in Vedic astrology, the placement of celestial objects will be roughly 24 degrees back from Western. And so, for example, if your sun is in Libra in Western, then there's a good chance it'll be in Virgo in Vedic astrology, unless it's in the last 6 degrees of the sign. So that's tropical versus sidereal. In Vedic astrology too, we place a lot more emphasis on the rising sign and the moon sign instead of the sun sign. So all the placements of all the celestial objects are important, but the rising and the moon are far more important in Vedic than they are in Western. And also in Vedic, we don't use the outer 3 planets. We don't use Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. And there's a lot of reasons for that I won't get into now. But you won't see those planets in Vedic astrology. Another thing I like about Vedic astrology is that we hone in on the signs, and we look at the smaller constellations that make up those signs and where the planets are placed in those constellations. And that can give us a little bit more of a finer insight into the energetics of a certain placement. In Vedic too, we see the human life divided up into these different periods that span a 120-year life cycle. And so everybody is going through these different periods in their lives that are ruled by different planets. And I like this because it gives you a sense of the kind of energy, the overall energy of this, whatever period you are in your life. For example, I'm about to enter my Saturn period, which is 19 years. And so it's just helpful to know that for the next however many years, you're going to be sort of marinating or dancing with the energy of that planet. And what's nice about Vedic astrology too is, in contrast with Western astrology, is that it's really been an unbroken tradition going back thousands of years in India. And so it's never gone through a period where it's been sort of pushed to the side, or there's never been any skepticism around it. And of course, this has resulted in other challenges, like that it's become very reductionist, or in India, oftentimes it's seen as a form of prediction. But for the most part, it's nice to have a spiritual tradition like this that's not only unbroken in its practice, but also integrated with the larger practice of yoga. So it draws on the Yoga Vedantic system, the philosophy, and the practices. For example, in Vedic astrology, when we highlight challenges or imbalances, right, or energetic patterns in the chart, we will oftentimes prescribe, in a sense, a certain kind of yoga practice to address that, or help you come into more alignment on that area of your chart, which is a really powerful aspect of Vedic astrology that doesn't necessarily exist in Western astrology. So I'm not trying to say that Vedic astrology is superior to Western astrology or to convince you of anything, except for the validity of astrology as a system. So as I said at the beginning, I had really powerful experiences with both Western and Vedic astrology. And so I think that it's such an important modality for us to continue to explore and adopt in this current era. So a Vedic astrology reading is a lot like a Western astrology reading. We look at the chart, we go through the houses, and we see the placements of different planets. But we also look at what's called the soul planet, or the Atmakaraka, and that kind of gives you a sense for the planet that is the driving force or the driving archetype of your life. And we also look at these periods I was talking about, the dashas, to determine sort of energetically where you are in your life right now and where you're headed and where you were. And it places your life in a grander context. And then, of course, like we would in any Western reading, we look at the transits that are affecting you today. And then we talk about some of these yogic practices that you can use that are custom tailored to your chart, that will help you to bring into alignment some of these imbalances that may appear in the chart, or to transcend some of the karma that we identify in the chart. So that's briefly Vedic astrology and what you can expect from a reading. So we covered a lot of ground today. We talked about astrology and put astrology in the larger context of the current kind of postmodern worldview, the materialist worldview. So then we did that by going back and exploring the whole history of Western thought, going back to the Renaissance and then up through the Enlightenment, and then through the earth-shattering developments of the 20th century with depth psychology and the work of Carl Jung. We looked at quantum physics and the implications of that, and the way that brings in these Eastern mystical traditions and unifies everything into an interconnected whole. And so it was a lot of territory we covered, vast terrain, and I hope it was illuminating and enlightening, and I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed putting it all together and presenting it in what I hope is a coherent and sensible discussion. So thank you again. You can check out the show notes. I'll put links to all these things I've talked about in the show notes at elemental.yoga/podcast. You can leave a comment or a question on iTunes or YouTube or wherever you listen. And you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to elemental.yoga/newsletter. I just want to leave you with this parting thought that whatever you seek, you shall find. Every being has the intelligence inherent within it to find what it's looking for. So make this seeking not just on the level of thought, but on the level of being. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time. Hario.